Today, my special guest was awarded Australian of the Year in 2011 for his philanthropy work over many years. He set the world speed sailing record in 1993 and then again in 2009. On the Little America's Cup on the C-Class catamaran 3 times, and is a founding patron of the Australian sailing team. Welcome, Simon McKeon.
Great to be with you, Steve. Sorry we're not on the beach at Macrae.
I love the backdrop. Like, look at the boats they've got hanging up there on the wall. They're going to come up in the Little America's Cup part. But, yeah, this is pretty lucky for everyone to get to see a little bit inside what the warehouse of the Little America's Cup was. It's unbelievable.
That's a top secret place. Yep.
It's down there in Dramana or something, isn't it?
Yeah, look, it's Steve, it's in the industrial estate at Dramana, and it's just one of 5 or 6 factoriettes, but it's right at the very end. And Lindsay Cunningham, the leader, of course, the syndicate going back 30 years, always wanted privacy and secrecy. You know, he didn't want people prowling around. And in the end, the factoryette right next door ended up being owned by a whole bunch of bikies. And 3 or 4 times have huge parties and 200 bikes would come. And we couldn't even get into the factory then. And we were worried they're going to blow it up or whatever. But we did survive. But it's a great little nook and cranny here, that's for sure.
Oh, great. Well, we're going to speak about the world sailing record because obviously that's very obvious. The Little America's Cup, and then a little bit about your Australian sailing affiliation. So let's jump into it. So yourself and Tim Daddo set the world sailing speed record back in 1993 with an average speed of 46.52 knots. That is 86.16 kilometres an hour or 53.53 miles per hour on Yellow Pages Endeavour, and held that record until 2004, 11 years. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, look, it seems now such a long time ago, and obviously with the advent of foiling, perhaps not every moth is quite going that fast, Steve, but certainly boats are generally going a lot faster than they did 30 years ago. We have the America's Cup boats up where we were 30 years ago. But at the end of the day, right back then, and it was really just us versus sailboards, and sailboards were little missiles with people on them. You know, in our case, we had this kind of clumsy-looking monstrosity of a thing, which some of us didn't even know which way was forward. But to actually get that up, you know, through the gears, right up to 45 knots or so, back then, long time ago now, it was honestly a magnificent effort on the part of our team. And I have to mention, team, I got the glory because I sort of steered the boat. But as you mentioned, Tim Daddo, extraordinary resource. He was the really the captain of the team in many respects. And then we had this wonderful dad's army of probably 20, 25 people, mostly retired because they had the time to actually spend all those hours on a long windswept beach down at Sandy Point, waiting for the right conditions, doing all the work that had to be done. It was a fantastic team to be part of. Well,
the boat's behind me. If I get out of the way a little bit, you can see the boat there.
See it. Yeah, no, I love that sign. Yeah,
it's a hell of an object, that's for sure. And I watched some video of it during the week, and it's very impressive. So, talk me through the boat. How did you come up with the design, or Lindsay come up with the design?
It's an important story because in 1991 we were in the final preparations of another Little America's Cup defence. It was a really good series, that one, against Pete Melvin, and boat was designed by him and Gino Morelli, and it was very close. You know, one race we actually won it by a metre or so. We might come back to that another time. But in the course of that preparation, one of our team members, round, I think, morning tea one morning, Graham Fraser, just simply said to Lindsay, designer, Lindsay, we're spending all this time trying to create a boat to go faster than, you know, any other boat in the world. We tack, we jibe, we go upwind, we go downwind. You know, we start and finish our races in the same place or whatever. But what about just creating a boat that sails in one direction faster than anyone's ever sailed before? It was a very interesting thought. I hadn't thought about it much. I'd been aware of the world sailing speed record, always held by countries in the Northern Hemisphere. But the brilliance of Lindsay Cunningham, Steve, was simply this, that he took that thought literally next weekend when we were out training again. The same question was asked by Graham Fraser. Lindsay went to his car, pulled out some old house plans, big metre by metre pages, and he'd actually got on the blank side of the housing plans and drawn, not just sketched, but drawn with engineering precision, his idea of a boat that would go faster than any other boat at that point. I kind of looked at it and wasn't even sure which way was up and which way was forward. It just looked so different, so radical. And I probably asked a couple of stupid questions. But the truly remarkable thing is that we, put our heads down, butts up, went through, defended the Little America's Cup that was probably a few weeks away at that point. But Graham Fraser's idea continued to linger, and shortly after we were successful, Lindsay said, well, what about it? Let's do it. And then we proceeded to actually largely recycle old C-class bits and pieces to create what was really only supposed to be a prototype, which is the boat behind you now. But ultimately, after 18 fairly hard and grueling months where we destroyed the boat a few times, we actually got up into the vicinity of the world record. And rather than just be satisfied as a prototype and retire it and then build the real boat, we actually went that little bit further and set the world record, just narrowly, but set the world record with that original Yellow Pages endeavour.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing boat if you've ever seen it or get the chance to see it one day. It's and get online, have a look, because if you type into YouTube or Google, you'll find the video of it going down the inlet there. Yeah. So talk to me about the materials used, because it's 27 years ago, and a few things weren't available back then.
No, they weren't. In fact, carbon fibre, or high modulus carbon fibre, which we were able to get and use, was still relatively in its infancy, even in the 90s. Lindsay Cunningham had, through one of our sponsors, managed to get a significant consignment of it in the early to mid 80s, which is such a long time ago. And we used, or Lindsay did actually use that original consignment to create the wing for Victoria 150 in 1985. So by the time of the early 90s, we were actually quite proficient in the use of carbon, and basically the wing itself was all made by Lindsay and the team. The platform, if you like, which John Bertram once described as looked like to him like a praying mantis, essentially has three very small little hulls or pods, of which Tim and I cramped into one of them. And then it was all held together by this three-part superstructure, really just a frame that connected the three hulls. I can see it to your right, in a Yellow Pages endeavour. And that was, again, where the real strength of the whole boat lay, and was obviously largely a carbon structure. We also had, I've just reminded myself that the Dolphin Striker, which was a little pole that went down below the wing and connected a carbon strap that went right under the main superstructure, connecting the three hulls to this Dolphin Striker underneath the wing. That was actually titanium, which was pretty amazing. I have to say, though, one day, Steve, we did this really rugged run down at Sandy Point. It was full on. And we got to the bottom, and Tim said to me, hey, that titanium rod, it's disappeared. It just actually wasn't in its place. It had gone. And amazingly, the boat was still in one piece. It just showed the real strength of I guess, those carbon fibre beams, which were doing all the work.
You were telling me a story the other day regarding getting carbon fibre and your affiliation with the CSIRO.
Yeah, look, it was, I'm stealing into Little America's Cup now, but in the early to mid 80s, the US had the Little America's Cup. and looked like they were going to have it pretty permanently, because there was this remarkable line of boats called Patient Lady, using full wings with a single slot, actually very similar to where the America's Cup ended up with their single slot rigs over the last few years. No surprise, because it was the same design team really that produced it 30 years later. Nevertheless, Lindsay had this idea of a more powerful wing, if I can put it that way, triple element, double slotted, just created more effective flow, especially downwind. But to do that, he required, really getting serious about carbon, because no other basic material would produce the type of outcome that he wanted. And this is where it got interesting, because we did have a fantastic sponsor, supplier, based in Europe, and they provided us, I think in 1984, a fabulous amount of carbon fibre. But the interesting thing, Steve, was that we didn't have the instruction manual or the resin to actually lay it up. We didn't know how to stick it together, to be blunt. And so a couple of us crawled off to CSIRO in Clayton, so it wasn't that far away, and we simply asked them nicely, could they help us with this carbon fibre layup technique that we needed to develop. And surprisingly, they said yes. We weren't able to offer them any money. All they said to us was, can you please give us some of your consignment? So anyway, they did what they had to do. 3 months later, gave us the manual and a resin, a big drum of glue that, and we went off and built our wing, and ultimately, won the Little America's Cup the next year over in the States. That was great. Unbeknownst to me, though, the CSIRO side of the story was fascinating, because at the time they could see that carbon fibre being used in aviation was a growth industry. Quite appropriate for Australia, because the old Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, part of the federal government, which was involved in the production of aviation bits and pieces, was interested in it at the time. CSIRO could not get its hands on high modulus carbon fibre at the time. And a couple of guys in shorts and T-shirt come along with this very significant quantity, and all they want is CSIRO to develop some techniques to help them use it. What I didn't know at the time was that CSIRO gratefully took some of the high modulus carbon fibre and then actively used it to work with the Commonwealth Aircraft family, and if we flash forward 2 or 3 decades, that old federal government business, if you like, was ultimately gobbled up by Boeing some years ago. And the largest part of Boeing outside of the US today is in Australia, and a very big part of it is at Port Melbourne. I don't know about COVID-19 at the moment, what it's done, but up until recently, it's been working 3 shifts a day, producing a wide range of carbon fibre componentry for the aviation industry. And I think a little bit of it has to do with a couple of guys literally with hay seeds coming out of their mouths 30-odd years ago saying to CSIRO, can you help us develop this high modulus carbon fibre into something that's usable? So
It's an absolutely fascinating story. I was so glad that you were able to share that with us. You told me about the other day, and I was pretty excited to get it involved in the interview. So back to the speedboat. Your roles. You were the skipper, and Tim trimmed the wing, not the mainsail, the wing. Yeah. So talk me through your roles. How did it work?
Well, firstly, Tim's got all the hard work. The wing's actually just above my head there, but it was a hard thing to control, because we had these wonderful Ronstan blocks on it, no issue about that, but we didn't allow much purchase, in that the wing needed to be manoeuvred quickly, to try and keep this boat in a level plane. And the ideal trajectory was something like our crew pod being 1 metre to a metre and a half off the water, just not skimming, just slightly elevated. A little bit of room for, if it dropped down a little bit with less pressure. It meant that we didn't hit the water and slow down. We didn't want to be too high though, because the boat was then out of alignment with its foils. So Tim was constantly just manoeuvring this main sheet basically to keep the boat in level plane. And even though a timed run at 46 knots was only 19 seconds, in fact, we were probably underway for a maximum of less than a minute by the time we went through our procedures to get up to top speed, did the run, 19 seconds flat out, and then it took us a little while to slow it down. I think it's the only boat I've ever sailed in that actually has a brake on it, and we needed a special technique to slow it down without losing control. And all the way along there, Tim is working incredibly hard. He's a very fit guy, and he was quite buggered at the end of that minute. My job's actually much easier. All I had to do was to steer the boat, although at times even that required 2 or 3 steering movements per second, which I'm still a bit staggered about, but it was like having to play a computer game, and just constantly move it. And then secondly, my most important job was to call the wind variation down the course to Tim. So we developed this single syllable language. We'd only have time to speak in one syllable words. And Tim was not looking down the course. I was. He was 90 degrees to me looking at the wing, bracing himself against this platform so that he could really work the wing hard. And I would be trying to call to him around about 100 metres ahead the type of wind variation. So there'd be slight losses of pressure, slight increases in pressure. Even though it was the best course we could find, it's certainly not the best course in the world to set a world record in. There was variation of pressure down the course, and I'd be calling that to him, and he would have to anticipate and pull off as we went into a slight lull, ease off as we went into a bit of pressure just to maintain. So it was quite a complicated 19 seconds as we went down the course, let alone getting it up through the gears to the top speed and then finally applying the brake at the end.
So obviously you have a bit of a run in to the course. Is that mandate? Is that like you're only allowed to have a certain amount of meterage, or are you allowed to have as long as you like?
No, we can have as long as I like, but we cannot have any external assistance to get up to that speed. So we'd actually have 3 guys holding the boat in the shallows, or at least 2, because the thing was a bit of a bucking bronco. If you sort of let it develop a tiny bit of speed, you would lose it. So they would have it securely under control. We'd be monitoring the clouds coming across. We'd be looking for our right time to let it go, and then they would just release it. To actually get it going, I mean, it's a pretty horrible boat at low speed. It's got 3 stumpy little hulls that don't actually really want to go very fast. So we would ease off downwind a bit and try and get some downwind easy pressure to get her up on the plane. And then we'd tighten up a little bit and get more speed into it and get nicely up on the plane. The problem was that doing that little manoeuvre meant that we'd gone away from the shoreline. At that point, we had to then harden up as high as the boat would point and head back in towards the sandbank at around about 30 to 35 knots, which is actually pretty scary because every now and then the steering failed, and it's not really that much fun heading towards hard sand at that sort of speed. And then probably the most critical part of the whole manoeuvre was just towards the end, I'd be saying to him, okay, we are under control, we're feeling good, sand's coming up, all in a monosyllabic language. And that was his message to know, okay, we're now going for it. I would see the start line and we'd do this lovely bear away, going quite close to the sand. I'm talking about 2 metres. In fact, once or twice I flew the hull over the sand, and I wasn't really allowed to do that. Lindsay didn't like me doing that. But we'd do this really lovely bear around very close to the sand and then hit the start line, hopefully at top speed. Now, it was really hard to do that, and most of our very best runs were probably 3 or 4 knots below our desired speed as we went through the start line because of that S manoeuvre, if I can describe it that way. And then we had to make up for lost ground over the next few seconds to get up over what was ultimately an average record speed.
It's utterly fascinating. Like I said, I watched some footage of it the other day, and I might try and get it put into like this point now in the video so that people can have a look at it. So you did it at a location called Shallow Inlet.
Yeah.
It's down in the South Gippsland. It's if you've ever been there, it's a beautiful place. It's
fantastic. Yeah.
This little like it says inlet, and it's a lot of kite surfers and wind surfers go there. And I think as you've told me previously, you had quite the arrangement with the windsurfers. An alarm would go off and all the windsurfers would get off the water and it said, we're going to have a run now, and everyone would stand and watch. Tell me about Shallow Inlet and how you guys chose that location.
I think you've described it really well, Steve. It's a place you do fall in love with. It's probably 2.5 hour drive away from much of Melbourne, and pretty remote, can be windswept. We were essentially looking just for 19, 20, 21 knot sou'westerlies, which should be a fairly standard frontal breeze that comes to that part of the continent. We found it simply because, in all reality, we were a bunch of amateurs. We all had, well, most of us had jobs and commitments and what have you. And unlike, say, some of our competitors around the world, for example, Paul Larson holds the record now, and, you know, amazing effort that Paul and his team have done. But they would actually, you know, decamp and go off to Namibia for months on end. You know, we could never, ever do that. So it was a matter of finding what was the best place in Victoria. And the sailboarders put us onto it. They said, you know, come to Sandy Point. Interestingly, Lindsay even investigated Mud Island out in the middle of the bay at one point. There's this amazing lagoon, many people don't know it, in the middle of the 3 islands that comprise Mud Island. It's only about 1 metre deep inside. There's 10 million birds, which could have been a bit of an issue, but obviously very flat water. That wasn't practical for all sorts of reasons, but we did end up at Sandy Point. The local community really embraced us, which was lovely. And as you said, we had to share the water with a whole bunch of other people as well, but they were all incredibly respectful. We only needed a few minutes, probably every hour at the best, and they very politely just got off the water and watched what we did, successful or unsuccessful, and then went back to blasting themselves up and down the course.
As you said, you probably get, 4 or 5 runs a day, maybe, at best?
Maximum, yeah, 4 or 5. Well, it was even worse than that because, you know, we had to abide by a complex set of rules that came from the authority that was based in London. And obviously, you know, tide was an issue. We couldn't unfairly run with tidal assistance. And in fact, the rule said, I think the max tide or current that you're allowed to have was a knot or something. So, you know, our international judge would be regularly checking when the tide had increased to a point which then meant that we could no longer run. So our actual window per day really of usable weather, tide, et cetera, was generally no longer than 4 hours. And if we could do a run an hour or a run every 3/4 of an hour was about as good as we could get, we were doing well.
It is quite the tidal place down there. If you've ever been there, it floods in real hard and it floods out real hard. So, yes. Yeah. And how did you pick your runs? How did you know, all right, this is it, let's release and go?
There was a lot of waiting. There really was. Anyone who's familiar with a sou'westerly frontal system that comes through knows that there is a lot of variation in it. You know, a so-called 20 knot or 25 knot sou'westerly is actually full of, you know, variation. And I would actually often run up to one of those rotten sandhills, and I call them rotten because, you know, there were lots of sandhills and they actually impeded the constancy of the breeze flow. But there was one that was fairly near our commencing point, or one of our commencing points, and I'd often run up there and then have a really good look towards the prevailing wind and see what little frontal systems were coming along. And then I could run back and say to Tim, look, I reckon there's something good coming in 10 minutes. And even though we might have been in a pretty fair 18 to 19 knots at the time, there were many times when we just decided to wait another 5, 10, even 20 minutes because we could see something coming across that could just have that magic extra 2 or 3 knots, which, could be the difference between a really nice run and a spectacular one. So, yep, there was lots of patience required.
Tell me about the runs themselves, because they do have a strict requirement with the measurement.
There were, we certainly had to have an international judge on station all the time if we really wanted to set a record. Sometimes we did some practicing or development, which didn't require such a judge. But if we wanted to set a record, we had to have, someone there. And they, as I said before, firstly had to check the tidal flows. They had to be satisfied that we had the course. We had, flags at each end of the course, so we knew what 500 metres was. I think we erred and always made it 501 metres or something like that. And then we also had this is 30 years ago, and just putting a GPS on the boat, which I think is now allowed, that wasn't the deal back then. And, we had a complicated system of video cameras at start and at finish, and they had to be perfectly correlated together. And that was the way in which the timing, as I said before, around about 19 seconds, was actually calculated. And there were 1 or 2 times when we did magnificent runs and one of those bloody cameras conked out because, it was in quite a hostile environment with fine grained sand blowing in your face and occasional rain showers and all sorts of things. So, the clunky old video cameras let us down once or twice, I do remember.
It's, time has gone pretty quickly. GPS now is everywhere. It's in your watch. It's, and having to run it by a camera is pretty fascinating. So if 46.52 was your max speed as the Endeavour, well, no, actually not max speed, average speed. Speed. What was your max?
The max happened in, I think it was early 93. So we'd launched the boat in 92, September, October-ish, and did some good runs then. Probably destroyed it, though, at the end of that series. We always destroyed the boat at some point, and then that would be the end of that campaign. We went back in autumn of 93, and I think that was the time we did an amazing run. We actually hit 55 knots, which back in 93 was kind of just unheard of. But we only did it for a very short period, and it was associated with completely losing steerage. In fact, 2 or 3 of our rudders actually broke off under the strain. And we did this giant jibe at very high speed. It was quite spectacular. And Tim and I ended up, felt like meters below the surface of the water, just surrounded by wire and broken shards of carbon fibre and all sorts of horrible things. And it was quite murky and, I honestly didn't know which way was up. I remember when I opened my eyes and I had this helmet on and, a full wetsuit. And it was one of those awkward moments where I said, I'm not really sure where to swim now. And I'm not sure that I can swim anywhere anyway because I'm absolutely trapped inside a whole lot of stuff. Nevertheless, we got out and the boat was in 1,000 different bits and we collected the bits, got them back to the shoreline and, we were a very bedraggled bunch. And I remember one of the last statements that was made that day when we'd cleaned all the wreckage up. I think it was Lindsay said, do you know what the good news is? And I said, there's no good news from today, sport. There's no good news at all. He said, actually, you were doing 55 knots when that happened. And, so that was pretty quick at the time.
Now, you made a funny statement there. 1 or 2 or 3 rudders broke off. A lot of people are used to having 1 rudder on a boat or 2 rudders on a boat at max, maybe being a catamaran. How many rudders did you have?
Yeah, we had around, I can't remember the exact number now, but it was either 3 or 4 foils on each of the 2 leeward hulls. So on the back hull, they were basically centerboards. They didn't steer. And they could actually be clocked over a little bit and gave a bit of lift after we reached a certain speed, which was, far from foiling. The boat was still a little bit in contact with the water, but absolutely lessened the mass of it, if I can put it that way. On the front, the front pod, there were 4 rudders, and they're only around about 200 mil in the water, I think. So you had to be very careful. If you went into an area just with the slightest waves, you had to, you knew there wasn't much rudder in the water, and if there was a little bit too much bounce, particularly with that front hull, you would suddenly again go into bad jibing territory. Having said all that, we only needed literally a few mils of rudder to be in contact with the water for them to have effect. But the main problem was just even though they were constructed as well as we could make them out of carbon and what have you, the pressures they went under every now and then just meant that they destroyed themselves. And we did a couple of runs. We started with 4 rudders. The run seemed to be quite uneventful. We got to the other end and we lifted the boat out of the water. There were only 2 rudders there. And that did happen on too many occasions, Steve.
So doing 50 knots and you've got a 200 mil rudder, and what is the boat like to steer? Especially, at those speeds. Is it easy? Is it light?
Look, the only thing I could go on was this boat. I hadn't actually spent a lot of time going fast in power boats and jet skis and all that sort of thing. And for me, particularly Yellow Pages Endeavour was absolutely always on a knife edge. It was a really flighty boat, if I can put it that way, and it wasn't that easy to lose control of it. And as I said earlier on, there were times when I was literally doing, believe it or not, 3 movements per second, just to keep this thing on the straight and narrow. The brilliance of Lindsay and Tim, when they built the real boat, Macquarie Innovation, was fantastic. They spent an awful lot of time not only on the shape of the foils, because Lindsay had known a long time ago that to get through around about 47 knots, and the America's Cup guys, I know, have found the same thing, you're starting to really do some very tough things with water molecules at that speed. Bearing in mind we're using asymmetrical foils underneath the boat, the molecules on the leeward side are having to go a little bit farther than the molecules on the windward side. And around about 47 knots, the molecules on the leeward side actually just gasify. They just, become air. Leads to cavitation. That was our single biggest issue over the decades to really get up through 50 knots. But associated with that was we were not asking an awful lot of a steering system. Bearing in mind, I'm the best part of 40 feet away from the rudders, and my rudder control lines, if you like, have to go down 2 long beams to get to the rudders. And yet, at times, I'm moving those things backwards and forwards up to 3 times per second. And the brilliance of Lindsay, just in his patient and extraordinary way solving that problem of physics and getting the right shapes at the end to get through 47 knots under control without the cavitation problem. And for me, a relatively unscientific person, Steve, all I can say, it was extraordinary seeing a true genius, and Lindsay Cunningham, in my opinion, is one, solve what was a confounding problem. It took him years, but by the time, and I know this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, and it did take many years, but I remember at a time when the Macquarie Innovation was going up over 50 knots, and I never told this to Lindsay, but I could actually steer that boat with one hand on the steering wheel and almost grant myself the opportunity of enjoying the experience. It took a long time. It was partly me, but it was mainly, partly me just getting used to it, but mainly an extraordinary scientific piece of work, refining. And look, it was never exactly relaxing, but there did come a time towards the end where you could actually sail that boat at more than 50 knots and feel as if it was actually really enjoyable.
That's amazing. That's so cool. Unfortunately, your record was broken by an Irish windsurfer in a man-made trench in France. What was that like to lose it to another windsurfer?
Look, all I can say is that, anyone, certainly, pre-America's Cup going this sort of fast, anyone up in that speed range, I always just took my hat off to them because I knew how hard it had been for us. And I can only imagine what it'd be like to take a windsurfer. You got no protection, no nothing. And I have been to the French Trench. It's just this, like it's Essendon Airport in a marshland. They just carve out these runways. And it's absolutely extraordinary seeing, these, and they're often really thick-set guys too who do the big speeds. And sometimes, they hit things too. And, my admiration for them is just as much for any admiration for anyone in our team. So I think we were about the first person to get on the line and just congratulate them when we heard the news. And, and that's the way it should be.
And then you got it back in 2009 with a speed of 50.8. And I looked up the speed, and as you said before, it got downgraded with tidal. So your speed you set was recalibrated because of tidal effect. So 50.08 was the top speed that you got on Macquarie Innovation, which was the second boat. What was the difference between the two boats?
Yeah, look, I think probably 3 or 4-fold. There was a design difference. Macquarie Innovation, looking at her now, was a little bit bigger than Yellow Pages Endeavour in terms of her envelope on the water. Beams a little bit longer, this sort of thing. Although her wing was shorter, it was stumpier. As Lindsay continued to think about optimising, high-speed wings,
less drag.
Yeah, that meant forget the C-class idea of going up to 40-foot rigs and make it a bit more squat. And aside from that, it was basically a matter of refinement. The big issue was the one I shared with you before about steering and rudder design, et cetera. But there are a myriad of other little things that just went into making the boat far more saleable. At the end of the day, there was a big psychological element. It was kind of in a way, it was simple to get it up to, the high 40s anyway. For Tim and I to have the confidence to then really press the accelerator a bit hard and push this boat hard only for 20 seconds, but that actually really took a particular confidence in the boat, which those hours and hours and hours and hours of refinement gave. And, it was an interesting thinking back on it.
And looking back on it, do you think you reached your ceiling with the boat?
I remember the day that Lindsay said, it was Tim said to me, you realise Paul Larson has absolutely obliterated our record. And he told me the detail. And interestingly, we'd been watching Paul's team, the Vestas team, for a long time. And I think Lindsay said to me at one point, if those guys ever get their act together, it's an amazing concept and they will blow us out of the water. But they took a very long time, a bit like us. And there was never any guarantee that they would get there. They spent a lot of time in the 30s, in the low 40s, and seemed to have their own ceiling issues whilst we happily held the record. But then over a relatively short period of time, they just blew all of us away, hydropter from France. And I do remember that morning that I think Tim rang me and said, have you heard what's happened overnight? They're kind of light years ahead of us now. And Steve, I knew at that point, as did Tim, that our wonderful campaign had given us so much joy and heartache over so long was absolutely at an end because, coming second, terrific, but it's not the goal of what you do when you set out to come. And we knew that everything we had created, we probably hadn't quite fully exploited it. Look, I would have loved to have done a sweet run at 55 knots. We were up in that territory with the new boat many times. And unlike Yellow Pages Endeavour, fully under control, but to actually do a 500-metre run averaging 55 was just a tiny bit beyond us. But to get up into the 60s and then 70s, hats off to Paul and his team. Truly remarkable.
Well, that was going to be my last question. 45.4 not average by our friend, because we both sail A class against him, Paul Larson, and he's a lovely man. It's an amazing speed. It's light years ahead of everyone else.
So I think you said 45, 70.
No, sorry, 65.45 knots.
65.
Yeah, 65.45 knots. So is anyone ever going to beat it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I don't know how, why, when or where, but they will. And, even if I can just say a very simple thing, even going back to C class, which look absolutely prehistoric now compared to what even you're sailing in a moth. But I remember just talking at some function, it might have been a Rotary Club or something, and I just happened to say, I didn't think much of it, but I just said, oh, yeah, in lighter breezes, we go 3 times the speed of the wind. And someone asked me this question, an elderly fellow, keelboat sailor actually, and he said, that can't be possible. And I said, oh, yeah. And I remember when I explained to him why it was possible to go faster than the wind by a big margin, multiple, that I suddenly reminded myself, in many respects, there are now no boundaries to top speed. It is all just a matter of drag. Back in my time, we were mainly focusing on air drag. And then with the advent of foiling, we've now, the whole world has shifted towards under the water. But, the creativity of mankind will continue to blow it away. Paul is a long way ahead of anyone else at this point. Someone will end up being a long way ahead of Paul one day.
Look, I really look forward to seeing it. I mean, I'd love Paul to keep the record. Maybe he will have another crack. But, yeah, to see someone go faster than that would be pretty impressive. Just one last question. I might have missed this. What sort of breezes were you doing 45, 50 knots in?
Yeah. The boat actually just wouldn't function in under 15 to 16 knots. And I remember actually having a whole lot of really sweet runs at about 16 to 17 knots of wind. I mean, they were just lazy Sunday afternoon sailing. But we would peak out in such a breeze at about 45 knots, 44 knots. It was a really pleasant experience, though, as I remember it. To get up above 50, we needed a minimum, I think, of about 19 and a half knots. So if we got a breeze that averaged 21 knots, that was absolutely fantastic. And I emphasize average because, again, anyone who knows Sandy Point knows it's really hard to get 20 seconds of sustained speed. Now, the board sailors will be saying, Simon, what's the problem with Simon? What's he worried about just trying to get this magic 21? Well, the problem was that up the other end, though, above 25, where the sailboarders are just starting to come into their own, if not looking for a whole lot more than that, sorry, our boat's maxed out. We can't sail our boat in over 25. It's truly, truly frightening. I reckon even Glen Ashby might have a bit of a struggle with it in that sort of breeze. And aside from anything else, the wave height really started to interfere with our 200 mil rudders. It was just too much bouncing. So we had this very narrow band, Steve, and as I said, the boat was probably optimised for 21 to 22 knots.
That's got to be hard to work in that little band. So, all right. Well, look, let's move on to the Little America's Cup because you've had quite the career in that as well. So you defended the Little America's Cup on the waters of Macrae in 87, 89 and 91, finally losing it in 96, I think it was. On a C-class catamarans named Edge 1, 2 and 3. So you actually didn't win the Cup to get it to Australia. You were telling me the other day it was Scott Anderson and Chris Cairns that got it.
So going back to 84, in fact, I'd been a very junior member of a syndicate that had gone over in 1977 to try and get the Cup back. And we'd failed, and that was using a then conventional 1/3 wing, 2/3 sail with articulated battens in it. But that was the very first time we saw the line of patient lady boats that went on for quite some time with their their fabulous wing masts. Anyway, Lindsay kept working and working away, and in 1985 we were ready to challenge, and we got the two best multi-hull sailors in the country that we thought at the time, being Chris Cairns and Scott Anderson. They'd won a medal at Los Angeles the year before in the Tornado. And, it wasn't perfect because they were both Sydney residents, but they came down as much as they could to train on Victoria 150. And it was just amazing seeing those two guys. I mean, it was a revelation for them and for everybody to see this extraordinary creation of the world's first functional double-slotted triple-element wing, which really took us into a new zone going downwind. She absolutely, cleaned up Patient Lady in 1985, and it was all downwind, lower, faster, and, it was terrific. Anyway, we brought the Cup back here, and probably the practicality of Scott and Chris continuing to try and do this thing in Victoria was no longer going to continue. So that's when David Churcher and I took over. And as you said, we had 3 successful defences and then got walloped in 1996.
Yeah, I remember seeing the last boat, Edge 4, because that was my time of just starting to come up to the Macrae Yacht Club. But tell me about the C-Class catamaran. They're a fascinating boat, and we don't get to see them much anymore.
No, I think I don't actually know when the last International Catamaran Challenge Trophy, as it's formally called, or Little America's Cup, was held. I think it might be 3 or 4 years ago. It's become very much a Northern Hemisphere or North American event, actually. For a little while, it was used as the test bed for the America's Cup, 40 and 50 footers. But look, at the end of the day, they don't really need 25-foot test beds anymore. There are so many platforms and what have you. The America's Cup is pretty much self-contained. But back in, when I was much younger, for me, seeing a C-Class catamaran, and gosh, I go right back to the early 70s, seeing them down at Sorrento, was just a world apart. There was really nothing like them. They were off-the-beach boats, but they were very big, 25 feet long, 14 feet wide, had these extraordinary wing masts, off the side of an aeroplane, going up to 40 feet high. And then as the years went by, those wings became very complicated. They would articulate port to starboard, slots, flaps. And even though really the sail area was only 300 square feet, what they could do downwind was quite extraordinary, courtesy of that slot technology. And as I said, Steve, there was just really nothing like them. And I, like many others, was just a young kid that was mesmerised by what they could do. And I just was incredibly lucky that I just fell into, the right group and had a modest amount of success as a teenage multi-hull sailor, and then got snapped up by this Cunningham syndicate, as we called it. And I did all the, the important jobs, like going and getting the morning tea from the local cafe and sharpening drills. And they wouldn't let me actually touch the boat, of course. But for me, it was just a huge privilege being part of that group, doing what I can now see was, real cutting edge stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the fascinating things about the boat for me is how big it was, but the helm hiked. And the crew, it was very much like the Tornado back in its days before it became a twin trapezing thing.
That's right. In fact, back in what was the early 60s, I think, perhaps even earlier, but the International Yacht Racing Union, gosh, that's dating me, came out with 4, indeed 5 catamaran types. There was the A-class that we're all familiar with, 18 feet long, one man, 150 square feet of sail. The B-class, which became really the Tornado, the C class, a bit bigger again, 25 feet long, and then they had a D class, which was, I'm not sure how long it was, 36 feet or something. But, they had these 4 different types of classes, and a whole bunch of individual boats came about as a result of those basic restrictions. The C class rule, though, was always dominated by the Little America's Cup. That was the no one ever built a C class other than to be serious about vying for the honour of defending or challenging for your nation the Little America's Cup. And being unrestricted, there were very few restrictions, just length, width, and sail area. They were the 3 most important restrictions, meant that it was a designer's feast. And those extraordinary aerodynamics of 30, 40 years ago, I still find as captivating today as I did then.
So you could have trapezed if you wanted to?
No, sorry, that was another rule, that there was only one person on trapeze. Funnily enough, I remember when in that 1977, no, sorry, in the 1985 series, when Chris and Scott were sailing Victoria 150, I was steering the trial horse, the second boat, and we actually rigged a second trapeze on it quite illegally just to try and keep up with Victoria 150, but it didn't do a lot.
Okay, so you don't reckon the advantage having a trapeze on there would have been another?
No, it's definitely a plus.
Yeah.
But, with a boat that's 14 feet wide, not quite as big a plus as on a narrow beamed boat.
So I can see Edge and Edge 2 behind you.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the 4 or 5 boats if you call Victoria 150 in there as well? What happened throughout the years to change up the boats?
Look, the basic design stayed the same, and it was really just a constant evolution from year to year to year. So, each defence, a new set of hulls, a new platform was built, typically a new wing. And all I would say in answer to your question, Steve, is that the boats became sleeker, lighter, the rig's a bit taller, the control systems better. But if I can just jump to this point, in 1996, I won't say we felt confident. You never feel confident. But there was just one thing we didn't do. And I'm still haunted by it today, because as we lined up for the start of the first race, and I remember it was actually very light conditions, and I remember that, and I think Duncan McLean on the opposing boat probably felt the same, but we wanted to go right shortly after the right-hand side of the course was favoured. So we were up the right-hand end of the start line, and I didn't actually mind being almost lee bowed, if you like, by him, because I just wanted to be able to tack away when I could. Anyway, we went over the start line, and I just remember looking up at the leach of his rig. And even though he'd be, and I just looked up and I said to Dave Churcher, my crew, check out his leach. It's twisting right off. This is a solid wing, but they've either broken something. I don't think that's right, because it's pretty light. And I remember as if it was yesterday, because we suddenly had this awful reality that they had solved a problem that we'd been thinking about for a while. Namely, could you actually twist off a solid rig? And we had a tiny bit of it, but not much. And they had it beautifully put together. And I remember as they sailed away from us, and it was important that psychologically I didn't let that get to us, because, just to see this beautifully twisting solid wing was, I've got to say, a bit of a handicap at the time.
Was there ever any thought to go back and try and get it back?
I think, Steve, come 1996, and this is definitely not an excuse, but we'd had some really full years at that point with the World Sailing Speed record. We set the record. We were well underway with the Macquarie Innovation Campaign, and then all of a sudden we get another challenge for the Little America's Cup, and we didn't respond to it ungratefully. I mean, it was fantastic to have another challenge, especially from the likes of Duncan McLean and that North American team. But in some respect, as an amateur, time-poor syndicate, we were really torn apart here. We were caught doing two different things. And I have to say, when we lost the 1996 Little America's Cup, and full marks to the Americans who just, had a better boat and probably sailed better as well, I think that released us then to focus on 50 knots. Tim in particular, Tim Daddo, had often called it unofficially Project 50. Let's be the first humans to get through this mythical 50-knot barrier. And I was captivated by that as well. And I think it was a pretty binary decision. Let's just do the one and let's give it our all. And that's actually what we did.
It takes superhuman powers to do something at such a high level on two fronts. And I mean, you look at the people like Peter Burling and Blair Tuke at the moment, skippering an Olympic 49er campaign while doing America's Cup campaign and now doing a Sail GP campaign.
But it's worse than that, because I just read overnight that Peter was talking about another Volvo or whatever that's called. And, very seriously, he said, I didn't get it. He didn't win it last time. So that's still on his bucket list. I can't. That's amazing. Doing all of that.
To be honest, I mean, my last question about the Cup is I'd love to see it again. I'd love to see like a Glenn Ashby and a Blair Tuke and a Nathan Adderidge and all these guys get involved, because back in the day, it drew a crowd. Like someone was telling me yesterday that the Prime Minister turned up once.
Absolutely. No, he launched Victoria 150, Bob Hawke, who only died, a few months ago, and he was a character. Look, it did attract big crowds, and I've forgotten that now. It was a bit funny because you don't associate really big crowds with, especially a little off-the-beach club like Macrae, which you and I love so much. But, no, they were interesting days, and it was the same a decade or two before that back in Soreto. But who knows? Who knows?
So we'll move on to the next topic, is the Australian sailing. Now, you were a founding patron of the Australian sailing team. So talk to me about this role.
Well, firstly, look, it sounds a nice role. I really don't do anything, but I think there is an important story here because, if you live here in Australia, I think we often forget that the sport of sailing in Australia is, I think, and probably it's the same in New Zealand, but there are many of us that for whom it's been a really important part of our lives, and it's a great community. It really is, and we all do take it, more seriously than I think many of our counterparts overseas. And we've had reasonable success, of course, in a range of different events, including the Olympics. And then we get to the year 2000. The Olympics, Steve, is here in Sydney. It's on our home turf, and we do pretty damn well in the sailing event. Certainly, Tom King with the 420s and 470s and what have you. And then we go off to Athens, and I shouldn't say I've never had anything to do with the Olympics in a real sense. But at the end of the day, for whatever reason, our team didn't get one medal. I think the best we got was a fourth place. And that was a very confronting moment for not just Olympic sailors, but I think the entire Australian sailing community. We were the country that had first won the America's Cup. We'd tasted success in the Olympics. There were all sorts of other things that we could say with pride Australia had done really well in sailing. But all of a sudden we'd had an Olympics where we hadn't won a medal. And it was actually John Bertrand, I think I'm right in saying this. John said this is not good enough, and he organised just for 5 or 6 people to, I think, have lunch at Royal Brighton Yacht Club shortly after those 2004 Olympics. I don't even know why I was invited because, as I said, I've never been a serious Olympian. But perhaps John was just wanting to get a group of people together that could at least talk about mapping a pathway forward to get Australia back on the right pedestal that it deserved in the Olympics. And it was a great little session. And I met one or two people for the first time, particularly a guy called Peter Condy, who I think Etchells, laser sailor, and a really fine management consultant in business. And anyway, as we talked about what was required, what wasn't required was the talent, because Australia oozes talent in sailing. We export talent to all the America's Cup teams, for example. But what we needed was a superstructure behind it to allow the talent to blossom. We needed a proper, if you like to use a boring term, management structure, so that all the things that lead to success for those frontline athletes were there. And in truth, as I heard about what others were saying at the time, we'd actually allowed that bit of it to drop a bit. We'd sort of coasted along on our successes in 2000. So in any event, to cut a long story short, the plan really was an 8-year plan. Beijing was coming around in 2008, but it was really the next Olympics after that to become London, because we really thought it would be a multi-year program. But to the great credit of a number of people, but particularly Peter Condy, who we put a lot of pressure on him. We said, Peter, you're the guy that can actually do this. You're a fantastic management person as well as a fantastic sailor. You see both sides of what's required here, and you're prepared to give up your day job and become, the manager in charge of our Olympic effort. And terrifically for the nation and for all our sailors, he said yes. And I think he is the unsung hero of what then happened. But the talent still keep coming along. That was not the issue. But I think when we finally got to Beijing, our athletes really felt that behind them was this superstructure of everything from research, development, financial resources, everything that management should do. And the results were actually ahead of what we anticipated. And it's been terrific to see then what happened in 2012 and, of course, in 2016. The only depressing thing is that the world keeps getting more and more and more competitive. And just as our swimmers are finding, it's bloody hard to stay on top of the world. But all I know is that I think we're doing it so much better than we did once upon a time. And it is a great credit to everyone who takes an interest in Olympic yachting.
I agree thoroughly. It's been a really good ride that the Australian sailing team have been on, and let's hope it continues for many years to come. Going to jump into my last two questions. What excites you about sailing today? Because I know that you're at Macrae Yacht Club every Saturday and you're raring to go and you sail your A class. And then also, what do you think about where sailing is today? The boats and stuff like that.
I'm going to give you an odd answer because, I'm certainly not the best sailor. Everyone I sail against knows that. But I've had this incredibly lucky ride through sailing, and I've tasted that, the really fast side of it. And I've had the privilege to work in an amazing syndicate with brilliant people, geniuses, as I described before. I reckon for me, though, the best way I can answer your question is that for me, the really special part of sailing has actually not been all of that, but has been the opportunity just to mix with a whole bunch of like-minded men and women who just enjoy getting out and sailing. Unashamedly, I'm interested in sailing fast, and I don't sail the A class nearly as fast as people like you, Steve, as you know. But in my own little world, there is something really special about getting out, getting cold, getting wet, and then sharing that experience with a whole bunch of other people that have had the same experience. The highs, the lows, we get lucky shifts and we suddenly are up the front of the fleet where we shouldn't be, and then we get a whole lot of bad luck, and yet it's a shared experience after the race. And there is something special about that. The other thing I would say, and I'm going to embarrass you, Steve, now, because I've seen what I call this special sport, which is a whole lot bigger than just sailing on a Saturday afternoon, obviously. It's an industry. You are part of one of Australia's success stories. iconic, Ronstan. And, you know, for many, it's a career like yourself. But I remember you as a young little kid, excitable, loud, passionate. I couldn't have predicted where you were going to go. All I know is that, and I do know this, that the world of sailing, which you have given so much to, has also given you a lot and has helped shape you. I know what turned you on, and it's very, very positive. And I just say it might sound a bit quaint, a bit old-fashioned, but it's more than winning yacht races. It's more than high tech and research and development and getting your name in the paper. It is actually about a community which assists each other. The final thing I'm going to say is the best thing about sailing is that each and every sailor in this country can say g'day to a Glen Ashby. We can't do that with soccer players, with tennis players. But this sport is still at a stage where our heroes, the Nathans, the Glennies, you know, the list goes on, they can talk to you just as people. I really hope the sport never changes like that. It might, as it gets bigger and bigger and the millions of dollars are handed out here and there to make things happen. But for me, that's a really special part of our sport.
It is. You're very much right. That's a brilliant answer. I loved it. So thanks for that one. My last question is, what would you give? What advice would you give to a young Simon McKeon or a young sailor of any type at the moment? Like, looking back at your time and what you've just said about sailing, what would you say to a young person that's just getting involved in the sport and you can see is super passionate about it?
It's a hard question, Steve. I'll have a go. My advice is get to know yourself really well. What I mean is we're the only person that we spend our entire lives with. And every now and then along the way, you're going to make really big decisions. Do we go left or right, port or starboard tack? You know? And you're going to get lots of advice as well. Now, some of that advice I'm sure is very well-meaning, but sometimes the advice actually might not be right for whatever reason. What I'm really saying is think these things through and make sure they are right for us. As far as, you know, the young Simon McKeon and sailing is concerned, look, I ended up having the luckiest ride of all. My talent really didn't mean that I should have ended up being in the positions I did. But I've got to say, I'm very grateful for that and I don't take it for granted. But at the end of the day, I just tried to make decisions that I thought were right for me. And one of those decisions was, as a very young boy, I didn't understand why people like sailing slow boats. Now, I'm not being disrespectful to people that made, but I can remember as a 13-year-old when I said to my dad, who asked me, would you like to get another second-hand boat? And I said, yes, I've outgrown the old one. He said, what sort of boat would you like? And at Macrae Yacht Club, it's had this long history of multi-hulls and, of course, mono-hulls. I just said, Dad, I just want to go fast. I don't think I was as good as Guy Bancroft in mono-hulls. But I didn't really kind of care about that. I actually just wanted to go fast. And I'm really glad that I listened to myself rather than spend a whole lot of years in cherubs coming second to Guy, because perhaps other older people in the club had told me that's what you ought to do. And without being silly about it, because sometimes we can take ourselves down the wrong path, there's no doubt about that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is understand who we are, what turns us on, what our motivations are. Don't be selfish. I'm not trying to say that at all, but I am trying to emphasize know who we are, please ourselves, and then I think we've got a good chance of having a good and satisfying life together.
That's great.
You know, me and the other me.
That's great advice, Simon. And look, I really appreciate you coming on board. It's been fantastic. And I really encourage everyone out there to hit the subscribe button and make sure they join the Ronstan channel. And you'll get to see great interviews like this with Simon McKeon. It's free. You just get reminded every fortnight or month that these are available. So I appreciate you coming on board. I really do. It's been great.
Thank you for doing it, Steve. It's a really great asset for the community. Well done.
Thanks, mate.